your live reading for you.
Morning, Brad. Morning, everyone.
Morning, Gary. Great to be here on another good Sunday morning.
Beautiful day. Let's start off with an article from the New York Times written by Julie Preston from Fairfax, Virginia, about a family anxiously awaiting a Supreme Court outcome. Jerry Pinto, an immigrant from Bolivia, has visions of opening a spacious carpentry workshop in this suburban city with his name in bold letters over the door. I want a place where I can be visible, he says, wistfully, but for now, he knows he has to lie low because he is in the country illegally. He runs his carpentry business almost from the cramped garage behind his house. Mr. Pinto is among more than 4 million unauthorized immigrants whose lives could be transformed by the Supreme Court. On Monday, the justices will hear oral arguments in a challenge brought by 26 states led by Texas to President Obama's effort through executive action to give the immigrants legal work permits and protection from deportation. Depending on the outcome, people like Mr. Pinto will have a chance to come out into the open or will remain perhaps for years in a twilight underground. And the stakes are high in this election year, since the two leading candidates for the Republican president nomination, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, Texas, have both said they would deport all 11 million foreigners in the country illegally. The larger of the president's programs before the Supreme Court would benefit immigrants who are parents of United States citizens and legal permanent residents if they pass background checks and have no serious criminal records. Most of those parents have families like Mr. Pinto's, an immigration mix that leads to differing opportunities and limits, and to openness, secrecy, and fear all within one family. His wife, Elvira, 47, is from Mexico and also here illegally. His daughter, Amber, age 22, and son, Jerry Rodrigo, 15, were born in Bolivia, but have grown up like American children in Virginia, although without legal residency. His youngest son, Christian, age 8, is the American-born citizen who makes his parents eligible for Mr. Obama's program, should it be affirmed. Mr. Pinto was the first in the family to come. He and his wife, whom he met while they were studying in Mexico to be economists, were middle-class professionals in Bolivia before the economy collapsed in the 1990s. They returned to Mexico, and in 2004, he joined the tide of Mexicans running the border into the United States. He recalls being lost for 4 days without water in the Arizona desert in the heat of high summer, his feet so blistered he had to crawl. He made his way to Virginia, where he had relatives, and he quickly discovered the work available to him without legal papers or a social security number was in construction, outdoors. He soon added a second trade, learning plumbing to work 2 jobs at once, and then he learned another skill, making exterior moldings. Several years ago, he purchased an industrial saw that he installed in his garage and started his own company. Still, Mr. Pinto said, I can't think about anything more than survival and making sure my children have something to eat. Surrounded by the comforts of a well-to-do suburb, he sometimes could not pay rent or buy food. His wife cleans houses to add to the family income, but even after more than a decade here, she is often reluctant to leave the house. I hear news on the radio of an immigration raid nearby, she said, and it makes me think I might go out tomorrow morning and never return to see my children. The Pintos know how the Supreme Court could change things for them because of what happened to Amber. At first, she was very weary of signing up for an initiative by Mr. Obama in 2012, which gave a legal foothold to millions of young undocumented immigrants who came here as children, including authorization to work. I was giving my information to the government, Amber recalled. They are going to know my dad's and my mom's full names or address. Eventually, she applied. The impact was immediate. She got a secretarial job at Washington law firm to help pay her college costs. In Boulder, she joined a campaign to persuade Virginia officials to let immigrant students in the program attend state colleges at the lower residential tuition rates. Senator Mark Warner was impressed by her zeal and invited her to be his guest at Mr. Obama's State of the Union address in 2013. She was present, busting into tears when new Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring announced in 2014 that he would allow the immigrants to pay residential rates. After 2 years of community college, Amber will move on this year to a state university in George Mason. Mr. Pinto observed his daughter's gains with pride and a twinge of envy. We have to stop having our own dreams and just think about the future of our children, he said.
From the Lincoln Journal-Star, the wooden home barely withstood the first earthquake in Ozu, Japan. An even stronger one the next night dealt what might have been the final blow, if not to the house, then to Tanaka's family peace of mind. The Tanaka joined about 50 other residents of the southern Japanese town of Ozu who were planning to sleep in their cars at a public park on Saturday after 2 nights of increasingly terrifying earthquakes that killed 41 people and injured about 1,500, flattened houses, and triggered major landslides. I don't think we can go back there. Our life is in limbo, said 62-year-old Yoshaki Tanaka, as other evacuees served rice balls for dinner. He, his wife, and 85-year-old mother fled their home after a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck Saturday at 1 o'clock in the morning, just 28 hours after a 6.5 quake hit the same area. Army troops and other rescuers using military helicopters to reach some stranded in a mountain resort rushed Saturday to try to reach scores of trapped residents in hard-hit communities near Kumato, a city of 740,000 on a southwestern island. Heavy rain started falling Saturday night, threatening to complicate the relief operation and set off more mudslides. Daytime today is the big test for rescue efforts, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said Saturday. Landslides had already cut off roads and destroyed bridges, slowing down rescuers. Nearly 200,000 homes were without electricity. Japanese media reported an estimated 400,000 households were without running water. Kumamoto prefectural official Riho Tamaya said that more than 200 houses and other buildings had either been destroyed or damaged, and that 91,000 people had evacuated from their homes. Hundreds of people lined up for rations at distribution points before nightfall, bracing for the rain and strong winds that were expected. Local stores quickly ran out of stock and shuttered their doors. Police in Kumamoto Prefecture said at least 32 people had died from Saturday morning's earthquake. 9 died in the quake Thursday night. More than half of the deaths were in Mashiki, a town on the eastern border that was hit hard by the first quake. Japan's Kyodo News Agency reported that 4 people were missing in a rural area farther east of Kumamoto, where the landslides were triggered by the second quake. One landslide tore open a mountainside from the top of a highway to below. Another gnawed at a highway, smashed a house that had fallen down a ravine. In another part of the village, houses were hanging precariously at the edge of a huge hole that was cut open in the earth. About 1,500 people were injured in the 2 earthquakes. Officials said that the number of troops in the area were being raised to 20,000, while additional police and firefighters were also on the way. In Mashiki, where people were trapped beneath the rubble for hours, an unconscious 93-year-old woman was dragged out early from the debris of her homes on Saturday and taken by ambulance to a hospital. Her son-in-law said she'd refused to move to shelter with him after the first quake. When I came to see her last night, I was asking, "Mother, I'm here. Do you remember me?" "Do you remember my face?" She replied with a huge smile filled with joy, a kind of smile I would never forget. But that was the last I saw of her, he said. Japanese TV showed a collapsed student dormitory at Aso City University that was originally 2 floors, but now looked like a single-story building. A witness said he heard a cry for help from the rubble. 2 students were reported to have died there. The area has been rocked by aftershocks. The Japan Meteorological Agency said the magnitude 7.3 quake early Saturday may have been the main one, with the one from Thursday night as a precursor.
A lighthearted article in the New York Times Magazine written by Ava Steinberg about squirrels. And the philosopher William James once posed the following problem. A squirrel runs around the trunk of a tree, and a man trying to see the squirrel chases it. But in the end, the man is unable to catch up to the squirrel. All he sees is bark and more bark. He goes around the tree, sure enough, and the squirrel is on the tree, the philosopher says. But does the man go around the squirrel or not? This question boils down to if you're another kind of temperament, metaphysical conundrum, but regardless of how you answer the squirrel problem, the key just might be its perfectly ordinary premise. It assumes proximity between human and squirrel, and it also assumes that this close relationship means something. And why not? Because our daily paths are crossed by running squirrels. Shouldn't squirrels run through our philosophical questions too? James aside, we all too often ignore our squirrels and their meanings, even though we don't give it much thought. We are a party to an unusual social contract with the squirrel. She is the only mammal who lives free and works in open, direct contact with humans. Rats and raccoons hide in the shadows. Coyotes lurk on the periphery. The deer and the bunny might as well occupy a kingdom of thin air. Dogs and cats, noble souls though they are, have been turned into a class of indentured clowns. Squirrels, though, are right there with us. They live on our level and toil on the same schedule as humans in every season. They share our approach to life's problems. They save and plan ahead obsessively. They make deposits and debits of nuts and seeds mostly, build highways, returning to well-known routes and around trees, manage 30-year mortgages. They can inhabit a single nest for that many years, refrigerate their staples, in their case, pine cones, and dry their delicacies for storage, mushrooms, as we do. They work the day shift and live in walk-up apartments. And like stock traders, they gamble in the marketplace. While most animal breeds, as food becomes available, squirrels have developed the ability to predict a future seed glut and reproduce accordingly like bullish investors. Squirrels are scarce in literature, but the few appearances they have made are telling. Herman Melville identified the flying squirrel as a fiction writer's model for a realistic character. Creature is exactly as weird and incongruous as an actual person. One of Kafka's most unsung creatures was a squirrel whose bushy tail was famous in all the forest and whom he describes in a jolt in his notebooks as always traveling, always searching. However, it couldn't talk about this, not because it lacked the power of speech, but because it had absolutely no time. Our respect for squirrels as fellow commuters is all the more extraordinary when we consider that they belong to the hated rodent order, but squirrels' stylish outerwear and good manners make them kindred city folk, so much so that we pay them the ultimate urban compliment. We totally ignore them. Yes, there's tension. The squirrel is not man's best friend, but more like an honored frenemy. Squirrels are probably a bit too similar to us for comfort. They're workaholics, road ragers, and inadequate dads. They can be territorial and unkind to outsiders. They've been known to help themselves to the fruits of private gardens. I know this from experience. When I was young and orthodox, a squirrel absconded with my yakima, which I had taken off my head while playing basketball. I tracked her to the woods to her home tree, and I watched her clamber up to the snug opening of her den, a gap between her branches, which she gleefully, or so it seemed to me, disappeared along with my former yakima. Squirrel panic is not unknown in our country. According to an anti-squirrel website, John C. Inglis, former deputy director of the NSA, has supposedly said, frankly, the number one threat experienced to date by the U.S. electrical grid is squirrels. Of course, the counter-argument is so ethically ambiguous. It's no wonder an NSA officer would miss it. The problem, as always, is our own rapturous overuse of energy, our own monstrous overbuilding of infrastructure, not the few squirrels who are the ensnarled victims of it. We would do well to take small acts of squirrel sabotage as a gift, a free warning about overstepping boundaries and a reminder of the need to share. Minor clashes with squirrels, the occasional breaches in the grid, or the loss of a yakima here or there serves only as reminders that we can, if we choose, afford to live in a respectful peace with our neighbors. We have made a truce with the squirrels, and we have done so because in our own animal hearts, we know we've lost something precious at first. Trees, our own former homes, no longer chuckle with the sound of mammal home life. Gardens are meant to be shared, and as for my former yakima, it was put to better and more lasting use as a nest insulator for the winter. Let us not forget history. When European settlers landed in the New World, they nearly hunted the great squirrel into extinction. So who, I ask, is the pest? An interesting fact, humans bitten by squirrels in New York City in 1987, 95, humans bitten by humans in New York City in 1987, 1,587.
That's a good article and very true about our relationship with squirrels.
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Well, from the Omaha World Herald, imagine this. Donald Trump wooing delegates with rides on his gold-plated private jet. A wealthy Ted Cruz supporter wining and dining with them at the Cleveland convention. Welcome bags stocked with expensive swag awaiting party activists in their hotel rooms, courtesy of a well-funded super PAC. It could happen. The freewheeling Republican presidential candidate contest is fast turning into a personal persuasion game. as the candidates pursue a no-holds-barred effort to lock up delegates, and there are relatively few limits on how far they can go. The jockeying has led to accusations of unfair play. Trump has accused Cruz of luring delegates with unspecified goodies and crooked shenanigans, a charge that the Cruz campaign has dismissed. Under rules established in the 1980s, delegates cannot take money from corporations, labor unions, federal contractors, or foreign nationals. But an individual donor is permitted to give a delegate unlimited sums to support his or her efforts to get selected on the convention, including money to defray the cost of travel and lodging. A candidate's campaign committee can also pay for delegate expenses. Several legal experts believe a campaign could even cover an all-expense-paid weekend before the convention to meet with senior staff at, say, a Trump-owned luxury golf resort in Florida. Given the last contested Republican convention was 40 years ago, between Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan in 1976, many of Washington's top campaign finance experts are furiously paging through old Federal Election Commission options, trying to discern what exactly delegates can accept. We're in uncharted territory, said Kenneth Gross, a former associate general counsel at the FEC. And when you get into the heat of battle, stakes are high, as they possibly can be in terms of who will be the nominee. People are going to push the envelope, he said. Trump and Cruz are expected to look for every legal edge possible if neither is able to secure the 1,237 delegates before the July convention. Of course, also in the mix is Ohio Governor John Kasich. The candidates will be in a bidding war for delegates, said Brent Capel, a veteran campaign finance lawyer who's represented Democrats and Republicans. They'll live like kings at the convention, he said. The FEC delegate rules were established long before super PACs came on the scene and offer little guidance about how such groups can lobby delegates. The lack of clear guardrails has left party activists feeling unsettled. It's almost like we need a campaign finance system just for delegates, said Gregory Carson, age 27, who ran an unsuccessful campaign to be a delegate in Colorado last weekend. This is why we need to put serious thought into this and why we're immune to being paid off with below-board messages, he said. Since most delegates are expected to cover their own travel and stay in Cleveland, they could be offered thousands of dollars in assistance. Just how far has not been tested. If they decide to go to Cleveland via Cabo, Mexico, that might be a problem, said Anthony Herman, a former FEC general counsel. But it is unclear that such a perk would be made public if it was provided by a single donor. Under FEC rules, a contribution from an individual to a delegate does not have to be disclosed, as long as it was not made in coordination with a campaign or as an independent effort to boost a candidate. So that does mean gifts could flow to delegates unseen. Republican election law attorney Michael Toner asked, is someone going to show up in the Cayman Islands in January with a 3-week paid trip? That's not going to be readily apparent before the election. Still, Toner added, I think the vast majority of the deals are going to be political deals. People want attention and a seat at the table. That was the case back in 1976 when Ford leveraged the prestige of his office to try to bring uncommitted delegates to his side. He invited the entire state delegations to dinner at the White House and even escorted a group on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal to watch the July 4th bicentennial celebration in New York Harbor. Reagan tried to match him with his Hollywood connections, recruiting entertainers such as John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart to call wavering delegates. It was hand-to-hand combat, said Reagan biographer Craig Shirley. When it comes to getting delegates, it's the wild, wild west. Anything goes, he said. Well, not absolutely anything. State and federal anti-bribery laws would forbid delegates from just outright selling their votes, and most experts doubt there will be a systematic effort to try to win over delegates with cash. It's a pretty dangerous game to play, Herman said. The optics are so bad. Putting aside FEC exposure or even criminal exposure, I think the political exposure, if it were disclosed and the public knew about it, would be very unseemly. The campaigns declined to offer specifics on how they plan to woo delegates. Well, there is the law, and then there's ethics, and then there's getting the votes, Trump convention manager Paul Manafort said last weekend. I'm not going to get into what tactics are used.
Mark Santori writes from the New York Times about rescue author Rockaway. Amid a powerful storm, the Coast Guard devised an unconventional plan to save 7 scalpers. The 7 fishermen aboard the Carolina Queen III, a 76-foot scalloping boat that set out from Norfolk, Virginia, had been at sea for 4 days when the skies darkened off the coast of the Rockaways. Powerful storm system that had already lashed the East Coast, bringing tornadoes, thunder, lightning, high winds, and heavy rains was barreling down on them. Homes had been flattened, vehicles had been tossed like tinker toys, and trees had been ripped from their roots. At least 7 people had died. The crew knew they were in for nasty weather, but they were scallopers. Weather comes with that job. As night fell on February 24th, the wind started to blow across New York City. At 8:45 p.m., a large section of a facade collapsed on Fordham Street in the Bronx. At 9:19, a tractor trailer was blown over on the upper level of the George Washington Bridge. By midnight, there were reports of downed trees and power lines around the region. Off the coast, winds were gusting up to 69 miles an hour. The men on the Carolina Queen had a decision to make. One successful 11-day scalloping trip can pull in a profit of $500,000. Each fisherman can make $40,000 on a good voyage. The crew was open sea fishing about 30 miles off the coast as the storm approached. The men decided to steer the vessel closer to shore, past a predetermined demarcation line that would stop the clock on their allotted 32-day yearly limit at sea. The Carolina Queen had only 50 bags of scallops, 60 pounds per bag, on ice in a hold. With the scallop season drawing to a close, this trip was the crew's last chance for a major haul. When the skies cleared, they expected they would get back to business. But shortly after 2 a.m. on February 25th, the vessel, battled by winds and waves, ran aground. Soon, one of its generators failed, and the Carolina Queen issued a desperate mayday setting in motion a harrowing rescue operation. Next few hours, a Coast Guard boat capsized, and fire department vessels were unable to reach the stranded scallop boat because of the weather. Ultimately, the Coast Guard decided to undertake a daring airlift operation by a crew dispatched from Atlantic City. Nothing about this really was routine, said Deputy Chief George Healy of the New York Fire Department. This was a very treacherous operation. The airmen and women at Coast Guard Air Station Atlantic City keep a goldfish in their survival shop where they gear up before missions. The swimmer, as they call it, is named Ashton, a reference to Ashton Kutcher in his role as Coast Guard rescue swimmer in a widely mocked, cliche-ridden 2006 movie, The Guardian, and a weary acknowledgement that the Coast Guard is not always accorded the kind of respect reserved for other branches of the military. But the Coast Guard plays a vital role in protecting the nation's maritime interest. Since it was absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security, combating terrorism has been added to the sprawling mission carried out by its 88,000 active duty reserve civilian auxiliary men and women serving around the world. Despite the expanded responsibilities, its budget has been buffeted. In his 2015 State of the Coast Guard address, Admiral Zukov, the Coast Guard commandant, said 40% of the acquisition budget had been slashed over the previous 4 years. I'm concerned that aging platforms and crumbling infrastructure continue to hinder mission success, he said. Today, we're seeing a significant increase in demand across all of our daily activities, and it limits our ability to respond to major contingencies. Indeed, we are facing a time like none other in our nearly 225 years of service. Air Coast Guard Station Atlantic City at the William Hughes Federal Aviation and Administration Tech Center at the Atlantic City International Airport is the closest air station in New York City. It was formed in 1998 when Coast Guard Air Station Brooklyn and Group Air Station Cape May, New Jersey were merged. The squadron comprises 10 Dolphin helicopters. Its crews are responsible for covering hundreds of miles of coastland in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as interior bays and rivers such as Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware and Hudson Rivers, and Long Island Sound. 2 helicopters are always ready to be airborne within 30 minutes. Lieutenant Bruno, 31, was the aircraft commander on duty on February 25th. When the call came in that a fishing vessel off the coast of the Rockaways was in trouble. 4:30 a.m., his team was dispatched to New York City. A Dolphin helicopter can fly faster than 160 miles per hour, but it would still take about 45 minutes to reach the Carolina Queen. Helicopter crew members, including Maggie Chaplin, 32-year-old co-pilot, petty officer, Kinston Caldwell, the flight mechanic, petty officer, third class Joe Classer, the rescue swimmer, took off in darkness shortly before 5 a.m., knowing very little about what they might find. We knew it was a fishing vessel, and fishing vessels are always tricky, Lieutenant Bruno said. There are lines and riggings to contend with, and there often is very little room for error, especially when trying to pluck someone off the deck. And it can be more complicated when the vessel is no longer afloat. Normally, when a boat is on the waves, it has a certain rhythm. That is not the case when it has run aground. As the crew spread north, it was in communication with the fire department, which arrived on the scene shortly before 5 a.m. It was soon clear that this would not be a straightforward operation. The first distress signal to the outside world from the Carolina Queen was an emergency flare that lit up the sky shortly after 4:30 a.m. Aaron Bell, 25, a UPS worker who lives in an apartment near the water on Beach 56 place in Queens, said it was so windy and foggy you couldn't even see the ocean from the shore. But someone spotted the flare. Chief Haley said the first 911 call came at 4:42 a.m. The responders were on the scene at 4:47. Chief Haley has 25 years on the job. He has seen all sorts of disasters and is not one for overstatements. The ship was not more than 80 yards from shore, but once contact was made with those on board, it was clear that the ship and its crew were in dire trouble. We directed the captain and crew to put on exposure suits. He said, we had a fear that the boat was going to capsize. Waves were cresting as high as 14 feet and breaking on the ship. Scalibers were stranded as it might have been in the open ocean. As the fire department was responding, a 25-foot Coast Guard rescue boat was also racing to that scene. Dispatched by Coast Guard Station Jones Beach, the boat capsized in the rough waters near East Rockaway inlet before it reached the Carolina Queen. Its crew members had to save themselves swimming to shore. Team aboard the helicopter learned of that accident as they had made their way up the coast. You get a little nervous hearing that, Lieutenant Bruno said, but it was good to know they were safe. That part of the incident is still under investigation. The Coast Guard declined to answer questions about what might have gone wrong. Fire department had rescue boats to deploy, but the seas were so severe that the New York Fire Department had to wait for air support. The fire department helicopter, only a short distance away, was grounded because of the heavy fog. The crew of the Carolina Queen would have to wait. Scallop fishing may not conjure up the daring do of those catching crabs in the icy waters of the Bering Strait or the exploits of long-line tuna fishermen chronicled on shows like The Deadliest Catch, but the most dangerous fishing grounds in America remain those off the northeast coast, more dangerous than the Bering Sea. From 2000 to 2009, the years covered by the agency's data, 504 people died while fishing at sea, and 124 of them were in the Northeast. The scallop industry had the second highest rate of fatalities, 425 deaths per 100,000 workers. Among all workers in the United States over the same period, according to the CDC, there are 4 deaths per 100,000 workers. Size of the crew and time at sea contribute to the dangers. Drew Mickenbitz, a lawyer who represents the Fishery Survivor Fund, said that since 2010, the number of vessels permitted to fish for scallops has been limited, and with fewer unregistered ships at sea, there have been fewer accidents. The Atlantic sea scallop has been popular since the 1950s when Norwegian immigrants first scoured the sea south of New Bedford, Massachusetts. The supply could swing between scarcity and plenty, but in the 1980s, huge algae blooms known as brown tides appeared several years in a row and threatened to destroy the ecosystem on the East Coast. Even after those tides passed, the industry almost did itself in by overfishing. Only after regulations were passed in the 1990s and the industry banded together with the scientific community to improve fishing techniques did the fisheries respond. Now, scalloping along the Atlantic coast from Maine to North Carolina is the most lucrative fishing in the world. 2014, that catch was estimated to be worth more than $424 million. Most of the ships that fish these waters are registered. The ship is owned by Wells Fargo Scallop Company, but Bill Wills, who runs the company, declined to talk about this incident. through an industry spokesman. He said he wanted to thank both the Coast Guard and New York City emergency responders, and said the incident had been classified as an accident with no fault found on the part of the crew. Clock is always ticking. We get so many few days to go out. We have to find every efficiency to maximize our days at sea. Joe Gilbert, who owns the Empire Fisheries and is captain of a boat called the Regulus, in preparation for the Carolina Queens voyage, the crew would have spent days getting ready, buying $3,000 in groceries, loading more than 20,000 pounds of ice, and prepping the equipment on the twin dredge vessel. The vessel steamed north from the Chesapeake Bay, traveling 15 hours to reach the coast of New Jersey, where the crew would probably have started fishing, and then the work would begin. It's pretty standard for a crew to work 8 hours on and take four hours off, but in reality, it often is more like 9 hours on and 3 off. If you're a good sleeper, you are lucky to get 2 hours shut-eye before heading back on the deck.
From the World Herald, if Ted Cruz wins the Nebraska primary next month, he'll have no problem making sure the state's delegates remain loyal to him at the national convention. Then if Donald Trump wins in Nebraska, that becomes an open question. It appears that more Cruz loyalists lined up to become national delegates in this month's county conventions for the Nebraska Republican Party. Of course, whichever presidential hopeful wins the Nebraska winner-take-all GOP primary on May the 10th can be assured of some form of short-term loyalty at the national convention. Republican delegates from Nebraska are required to vote for the state winner in the first 2 rounds of voting. For Trump, the delegate rules could be a blessing or a curse, depending on whether he wins enough delegates to secure the nomination on the first ballot. It's widely perceived that Trump, the GOP presidential frontrunner, has the best chance of winning the nomination on that first vote. Nearly 95% of delegates are bound to the winner of their state's primaries and caucuses, even though many are expected to be Cruz supporters or party activists who may not personally back Trump. Trump has to be nominated on the first ballot or he will not be nominated, said Larry Sabato, a political scientist at the University of Virginia. Privately, almost everybody agrees on that. There are so many Cruz double agents among the delegates who are pledged to vote for Trump on the first ballot, but who will switch immediately on the second ballot, he said. Earlier this month, Nebraska Republicans began the process of choosing the men and women they will send as delegates to the national convention in July. And has been reported in other states, party regulators appear to have the edge over newcomers, including Trump supporters, in getting a chance to become a national delegate. Typically, the selection of delegates is a low-key affair, with party regulars vying for a chance to drink, feast, and mingle with Republican celebrities. This year, for the first time in more than 60 years, delegates might actually choose the party's presidential nominee at a contested convention. Neither Trump nor Cruz appears to be on a clear path to securing the 1,237 delegates needed to win the nomination in the first round. Nebraska sends 36 national delegates to the convention. 3 slots are given automatically to the state's party leaders. The other 33 will be elected at the state convention on May 14th. Those national delegates will be chosen by an estimated 400 delegates elected recently at the state's county conventions, which also chose another 400 alternate delegates. Neither Trump nor Cruz actively worked the county conventions, but numerous party and county officials who attended said Cruz clearly had his fair share of supporters, many of the party regulars who showed up in droves in Nebraska's 3 largest counties, Douglas, Sarpy, and Lancaster. My observation was that there was a very little Trump presence, and there were definitely folks who were supporting Ted Cruz, said Scott Peterson, former chairman of the Douglas County Republican Party. However, Trump was not shut out of the process, and some of his supporters were elected to the state convention. In rural areas such as Custer or Cherry County, there were plenty of Trump supporters on hand, according to party chairman. There was no evidence that either Cruz or Trump actively sought to ensure that his supporters attended county conventions. In fact, several people who were at the convention said delegates were not even asked to declare which candidate they supported. They were simply elected, as they always have been, based on experience and support within the party. The only presidential presence was a few booths set up by Cruz supporters at the larger conventions to hand out his campaign material. At the county level, I didn't see any organized effort to get these people elected to state convention who had leanings one way or another, said Tim Gay, who's attended the Sarpy County Convention. Instead, a top Nebraska GOP official believes that about 80% of the delegates elected were people who'd been long active in Republican circles. J.L. Spray, who's the Nebraska National Committeeman, said this does not bode well for Trump. Given his outsider campaign, Spray argued, Trump had more to lose by not working Nebraska's county conventions to get supporters elected to the state convention because Cruz tends to have more support from party regulars. Of course, Trump could still win all 36 of these states' delegates simply by winning the primary, a contest that's sure to attract national attention in this year's presidential race. It's unknown who has the edge because there's not been a poll conducted on the GOP presidential race in Nebraska. But several party leaders and others believe that Nebraska is tailor-made for the U.S. Senator from Texas, who has a strong evangelical following. Sabato said Nebraska is perceived by many at the national level to be solidly in Cruz's camp. One argument in Cruz's favor is that he's already won caucuses in 2 neighboring states, Iowa and Kansas. Cruz also has strong support from Nebraska's party leaders. Governor Pete Ricketts is officially sitting out the race, but his parents, Joe and Marlene Ricketts, have been giving significant sums of money to an anti-Trump super PAC. In addition, Senator Ben Sasse has helped lead the anti-Trump movement at the national level, becoming the first U.S. senator to say he could not support Trump if he becomes the party's presidential nominee. I don't think Trump has a chance in Nebraska, said State Senator Mike Groen of North Platte, who attended the Lincoln County Convention. Groen said that Nebraska is a closed primary, meaning that only registered Republicans will be allowed to vote for GOP candidates, which could leave out potential Trump supporters who aren't regular GOP voters. However, Trump has won in state after state, despite the fact that this event does not have strong support among the party faithful. And Cruz has some policy baggage that could come back to haunt him. Most notably, Cruz opposed ethanol subsidies that are popular in rural America. Said Craig Sanefek, the chairman of Custer County Republican Party, he said he's not yet decided on which of the candidates he will support if he's sent to the national convention, but he hopes that all of the delegates support the winner of the state's primary, even beyond the first 2 required ballots. I just hope Nebraska delegations are representing the voters, Sanefek said.
Mary Walsh writes in the New York Times about Richard Ransom, age 96, founder of Hickory Farms, died. 1951, finding specialty meats and cheese could take some doing if he lived in a small town America and had no neighborhood deli. For Richard Ransom, this was an opportunity. In his early 30s, recently returned from fighting in the Pacific, Mr. Ransom was tired of driving a vegetable truck around rural Ohio for his parents' wholesale produce business. So he started selling hand-cut cheeses at flower shows and boat shows. Soon he added summer sausage and then expanded to county fairs around the Midwest. He named his company Hickory Farms. By the time he sold it in 1980, Hickory Farms was a $164 million a year specialty food business with outlets in every state but Mississippi. Mr. Ransom died on April 11th in Toledo at 96. He had Alzheimer's disease, his son said. Hickory Farms grew in the early years thanks to what was then a novelty, free samples. It was almost impossible to enter a Hickory Farm store without tasting something, Forbes magazine observed in the 1983 business profile, describing the ranks of smiling apron-clad women positioned at store doorways and in the aisles with trays of food. The women did not bother asking customers if they wanted a taste. They just cut off bite-sized pieces and held them out to people, Robert Ransom recalled. Shoppers felt obligated to take and eat what they were offered, and after tasting meats and cheeses every few steps around the store, they felt obligated to buy something. It seems so simple now, Robert Ransom said. The elder Mr. Ransom also wrote an instruction manual for sales personnel explaining how to cut blocks or wheels of cheese in a way that ensured that shoppers would always get a little more than they asked for. If you magnify that over thousands of customers in 600 stores every day of the year, it's an enormous amount of money, that son said. Mr. Ransom sold Hickory Farms for $41 million in 1980 to the General Host Corporation of Connecticut. Analysts thought the price was steep and attributed it to Hickory Farms' shrewd marketing. The company has since changed hands more than once and has shifted to catalog sales. After selling Hickory Farms, Mr. Ransom formed a family business that invested in commercial real estate in the Toledo area. He served on corporate and nonprofit boards and founded what is now the Adopt America Network, which works to find permanent adoptive families for children in foster care. He was born on September 13, 1990, to Beatrice and Chuck Ransom, the owners of a business that bought that brought vegetables from farmers in northern Ohio, southern Michigan, and delivered them by truck to grocers. His wife, Elizabeth, died in 2009. In addition to the son, he is survived by 3 daughters.
Oh, I can remember all the samples.
They were great.
Those were great. And that's true. There really weren't free samples back then. So that was a novelty.
Yes.
Oh, it was tasty. Well, from the Lincoln Journal-Star, several University of Nebraska Lincoln researchers are focused on finding the best ways to detect the chemical compound used in explosive devices during recent terrorist attacks in Brussels and Paris. Triacetone, triperoxide, more commonly referred to as TATP, has been used for an explosive for decades, although recent attacks by Islamic terrorists in Europe have once again drawn attention to the highly unstable compound. Sensitive to shock, friction, or heat, TATP goes from 0 to 60, according to UNL professor Pat Dussault, who himself described it using a hammer to tap 10 to 20 milligrams of it, roughly the size of just like a pharmaceutical tablet, to create an explosion equal to a loud firecracker. Unlike other peroxides, which tend to turn to mush, TATP goes off every time, he said. Last month, Belgian authorities recovered 2 undetonated bombs at an airport containing 15 kilograms of the stuff, roughly 10 million times as much as the test described by Dussault. While it's manufactured with household items found in just hardware and drugstores, TATP can be difficult to detect. Dogs trained to sniff it often confuse it with bleach. The molecule's chemical signature is unmistakable, however. After receiving a U.S. Navy Space and Naval Warfare Systems grant in 2008-2009, a team of UNL physical, analytical, and organic chemists began working on detailing just how it worked, while also starting to study how it could be best detected and ultimately neutralized. It was a spontaneous thing, Dussault said. One person talked to another, and we just started gathering people with expertise. Professors like Gerard Harbison, who was in London in 2005 when 4 Islamic jihadists detonated backpacks stuffed with TATP on public transport systems. He said structural chemistry research uncovered the many ways the peroxide can be manufactured. How to identify each form came through spectroscopy, studying what happens when certain matter is passed through electromagnetic radiation. One solution Harbison worked on was determining how it evaporates slightly and leaves vapor and absorbs infrared light. Ceiling-mounted infrared lights could identify the presence of the molecule in a closed area, Harbison said. Another potential solution involved shining a visible light laser through the space of an area like an airport security lobby or terminal, measuring the molecules and modulations of scattered light for TATP signature. It wouldn't tell you who had it, but it would tell you that it was there in the airport, Harbison said. He said the Defense Department showed interest in the laser light detection method, although it was unclear if anything was ever deployed. Other detection models, like using low-frequency radio waves to detect the molecular signature or vacuuming air into a spectroscope to look for the chemical, have also been studied by the UNL team. We can conceive of a whole lot of ways for things to work in the lab, Harbison said, but whether they translate to the field is a harder thing to solve. Although UNL researchers do not have ongoing research funding to continue studying TATP, both Dussault and Harbison said they continue to work on the problem as time and energy allows. A lot of the good ideas are still in the lab, but there's no money or resources to pursue them at this time, said Dussault, whose research centers on peroxide, and said the results of the 2009 tests included several papers and a well-regarded view of TATP that's still being cited by other scientists across the country. It was once again at the center of an attack in Brussels last month. Funding for new research or to further existing research could come, though, at any time now, according to a National Strategic Research Institute executive. Bob Hinson, the retired Air Force Lieutenant General, said even with research funding earmarks going out of vogue, government agencies can shift funding sources if a need is identified. Established in 2012, Nebraska's National Strategic Research Institute nearly tripled its funding for a wide array of activities, including detection of chemical and biological weapons. It now is at $26 million in 2015. Dussault said research funding tied to the Department of Defense, unlike that of the National Science Foundation, usually requires a project to go beyond the fundamental science stage. At an extreme, they would want a system, Dussault said. We're kind of operating in that arena of trying to extend the fundamental science into something that could be used to better detect or neutralize the explosive. Research done by UNL scientists will likely be used by those who will create a reliable detection method geared toward stopping TATP-based attacks in the future. We're working on paving the road for someone else, Disselt said.
Eric Ekholm writes in the New York Times about Central Park sighting late blooming birder. You could call me an unlikely bird watcher. I haven't caught anyone snickering to my face, but my new hobby must seem improbable to my family, friends, and colleagues. I'm a confirmed urbanite and known as rather restless and impatient. I fidget terribly at my desk, getting work done in fits and starts between sallies for Diet Coke or coffee. How could I be drawn to an activity that requires silence and calm? And in Manhattan, of all places, I became a bird watcher, or at least a fledgling one, in a very New York way 5 or 6 years ago, apartment bound by a snowstorm and hoping to fill in a sparse social calendar. I was browsing the New York Historical Society's lecture schedule when an oddball entry caught my eye, a guided spring migration bird walk in Central Park. Made no sense, listed among the expected sessions on colonial customs and world affairs. On a lark, I signed up. On the assigned Saturday morning, early May, I showed up at an entrance to the Historical Society. We came across a huge tree that was surrounded by people in bill caps courting neck pain, their faces attached to binoculars or cameras with oversized lenses. This tree is very birdy, observed our guide, a naturalist artist named Alan Massett, more experienced in a crowd, generous with information as birders tend to be. Called out species and locations for the beginners. Black and white warbler halfway up the trunk. Magnolia warbler fork branched at 9 o'clock. Even with my lame eyewear, the anonymous dark specks were revealed as creatures with distinct personalities and stunning colors and designs. I went and bought a decent pair of binoculars for $250, and as turned out, social calendar was no longer so sparse. Vanessa, soon to be my partner, became an enthusiast too. I would say that our frequent birding jaunts offer the ultimate and cheap New York date, but the pecuniary advantage has been offset by an unleashed desire to photograph the generally uncooperative birds, forcing expenditure of thousands of dollars on bigger, better camera equipment. As for that apparent paradox of restless me seeking out elusive birds, the distinction I immediately discovered is a false one. Birding is never boring, and it induces serenity. If there is the smallest chance of a payoff for me, even a trite sighting of a robin with a worm, then every moment is filled with anticipation.
Well, from the World Herald, 4 laps, I can do it, Donna Jacobson said. Jacobson, the second lung transplant patient at the Nebraska Medical Center, gave a thumbs up as she paced Saturday for a mile-long walk. She held a medical face mask in her left hand and a gray Under Armour jacket wrapped around her waist. The 63-year-old was challenged to walk a mile in the Hero's Walk, a sign she completed her rehabilitation. She was among transplant recipients, donor families, and doctors, about 1,000 people, who honored both living and deceased donors during the 5th annual Donate Life Nebraska 5K and Heroes Walk. Signs lined the sidewalk of Exarban Village's Stinson Park in honor of transplant donors and those who died waiting for a transplant. Joining Jacobson was her husband, 3 children, and 8 grandchildren. Each wore a gray shirt that read, "Make every breath count." Jacobson, a nurse from the northeast Nebraska town of Winside, had a single lung transplant on January 26th and has been in rehabilitation in Omaha ever since. She was diagnosed in August with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, an incurable disease that causes scarring of the lungs and often respiratory failure. Jacobson said Omaha has become her second home, but she's ready to go back to Winside. Her husband, Randy, said Saturday's walk represented a miracle. He said he's worked to keep his wife's spirits up every day during recovery. "I took her to therapy 3 times a week," he said, "and I prayed for a lot on my own, but I didn't tell her that." Bobby Hefflinger, a nurse coordinator at the medical center, got to make the call when the lung came in for Donna. She just said, "Oh my God, let's do this." She's always been so positive, Hefflinger said. Dr. Heather Straw, medical director of the lung transplant program, referred Jacobson to St. Louis for a quicker operation, but Jacobson was determined to stay in her home state for the transplant. She pushed very hard to recover the past 2 years, Straw said, and now 3 months after surgery, she can walk. Dr. Aleem Sadiq, the Nebraska Medical Center surgical director of lung transplantation, performed the transplant. The lung transplant program was reinstated in the hospital in the fall of 2015 after being dormant for 17 years. Just one other patient, 58-year-old Phil Savago of Omaha, has received a lung transplant since the reinstatement. Nearing the end of the walk, Jacobson held her granddaughter's hand and said she was happy for the support. "I could go again," she said after she reached the finish line, "but I don't think I'm going to." Sounds like a great walk for a great cause.
Great story. Well, let's turn to the death and funeral notices for today, April 17th already. Achenbach Olivia, age 90. Services are going to be at the Forest Lawn Funeral Home, 7909 Mormon Bridge Road. Armin John Peter, age 57, and services are not listed. Barnes Earl, age 84, and services will be at the West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. Beerline William, age 77, and memorials are suggested to the Papillion Gun Club Youth Program. Services will be in Papillion at the Kaler Dos Mortuary, 441 North Washington Street. Bernard Barbara, age 67. Services will be at the Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Bozek Rose, age 92. Memorials are suggested to the St. Francis Cabrini Catholic Church. Services are at the Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Brady Robert, age 85. Memorials are suggested to the Maplewood United Methodist Church or to the American Diabetes Association. Services will be at Rotor Mortuary, 2727 North 108th Street. Burroughs Mitzi, age 66, and services will be at the Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 2202 Hancock Street in Bellevue. Childers Robert, age 77, and there are no services. Cole Maynard, age 64, and services will be in Mesa, Arizona at the Mariposa Gardens Memorial Park. Courier Maryland, age 82. Memorials are suggested to the family. Services are at the Rotor Mortuary, 2727 North, 108th Street. Darrell Jerry, age 70. Services are at the Bremen Mortuary, 6505 South 144th Street. Day Carroll, age 79. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 2202 Hancock Street in Bellevue. Day Howard, age 78, and memorials are suggested to the Tangier Children's Transportation Fund, 2823 South 84th Street, Omaha, Nebraska, 68124. Services will be at the Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 2202 Hancock Street in Bellevue. DeFontaine Marion, age 99. Memorials are suggested to the Fort Calhoun Fire and Rescue or St. John the Baptist Catholic Church. Services will be in Fort Calhoun at the Seavers Sprague Funeral Home. Dunzik Veronica, age 92. Services will be at the Bethany Funeral Home, 82nd and Harrison. Edson Lloyd, age 97. Memorials to the ALS Association. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Irwin Mildred, age 91. Memorials are suggested to the Health Partners Hospice and Palliative Care, and services are not listed. Federico Grace, age 76. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Helms Peter, age 89. Memorials are suggested to the Plattsmouth Rescue Squad or Church of the Holy Spirit. Services are in Plattsmouth, Nebraska at the Roby Funeral Home. Hammer, Doctors Laura and Christy. Larry was 75, Christy 73. Memorials are suggested to the Lauritzen Gardens. Services are in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Roper and Sons Funeral Home, 4300 Old Street. Hanson Craig, age 67. Memorials are suggested to the Plattsmouth Rescue Squad. No services. Heron John, age 80. Services are at the Rotor Mortuary, 4932 Ames Avenue. Horkey Sylvia, age 98. Family prefers masses. Services are at the Bethany Funeral Home, 82nd and Harrison Street. Jordy Irene, age 90. Memorials to St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 14151 Pacific Street. Kelly Patrick, age 73. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Kirschenbaum KB, age 86. Services, memorials are suggested to the Rose Blumkin Jewish Home, 323 South 132nd Street. Services are at Jewish Funeral Home. Kitson George, age 78. Memorials are suggested to the family. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Coranda Lilly, age 64. Memorials to the family. Services are in Wahoo, Nebraska at the Sabota Funeral Home. Matsunuti Donald, age 86. Services are at Arbor Cremation Society, 2819 South 125th Street. McAllen Dolores, age 101. Services are West Lawn Mortuary, 5701 Center Street. Moore Peggy, age 46. Services are in Crandon, Wisconsin at the Weber Hill Funeral Home. Nelson Lauren, age 73. Memorials to the family. No services are listed. Norden John, age 73. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Peterson Judith, age 76. Services are in Papillion, Nebraska at the Kaler Dose Mortuary. Prater Edward, age 89. No services are listed. Ramos, Virginia, age 79. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 3402 Sampson Way in Bellevue. Salkin, Sarah, age 90. Memorials to the Rose Blumkin Jewish Home. Services are at the Jewish Funeral Home. Schottenbacher, Betty, age 90. Memorials to the Mount Michael Art Department, Christ the King Church, Our Catholic Daughters. Services are at John Gettleman Mortuary, 1010 North 72nd Street. Sip Lone, age 88. Memorials to the Josie Harper Hospice House. Services are at Forest Lawn Mortuary, 7909 Mormon Bridge Road. Smith Lois, age 86. Memorials are suggested to the Bethany Lutheran Church, Dodge County Humane Society in Fremont. Services are in Wahoo, Nebraska at the Sabota Funeral Home. Steimer Glenn, age 81. Services are at Hefe Hoffman Mortuary, 5108 F Street. Maloney Edith, age 90. No services are listed. We want to remind you that memorials to the Radio Talking Book Network are tax deductible. We'll go a long way in keeping Radio Talking Book on the air. Please keep Radio Talking Book in mind when memorials are listed as donor's choice or your favorite charity. Donations should be sent to Radio Talking Book Network, 7101 Newport Avenue, Suite 205, Omaha, Nebraska, 68152. Thank you for being a Radio Talking Book Network listener and supporter, and we return you to Emily in the control room.
All right. That brings us finally to a break before we go into the last half of your live reading. We'll look out for about an event coming up, and then we'll be back to your live reading for you. Hello, everyone. Ann Pelican here, and I would like to invite you to an event coming up on Friday, June the 3rd, 2016, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Where will this event be held? It will be held at 1313 Fire Street, and this is at the Nebraska Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired. What are we doing? The EFB Omaha chapter will be hosting a non-visual training day introducing non-visual skills such as braille, game travel, computers, and home management. Learn how effective non-visual skills can be taught by blind and visually impaired people who use these skills every day. Anyone who would like to participate in this event, please register before May the 7th. There is no charge for participation. Lunches will be provided. In order to register, visit www.me.nfb.org, or you may call 402-350-1735. We would like to invite everybody to come out and to participate in this fun-filled day of learning. Thank you.
All right. That brings us to the end of your break. I want to remember that this is your Radio Talking Book Network, a print information network serving Nebraska and its neighboring states. The Radio Talking Book Network is brought to you with cooperation from KIOS-FM in Omaha and statewide through the NET Radio Network. Well, since that brings us to the end of your break, I'm going to head on over back to the gentleman over in the studio, and they're going to get right back on your live reading for you.
Thank you, Emily. It's now time for the Public Pulse, letters to the editor from the opinion page of the Sunday World Herald. First comes from Chicago. Joe Delish writes, the repeal of the learning community's common levy would be a tremendous step backward for the Omaha metro area and the state of Nebraska. The purpose of the state's school funding formula is to align a school district's funding with its needs. The World Herald's annual analysis of the winners and losers miss the entire point and does not actually measure the common levy's effectiveness. Since 2010, the common levy has dramatically improved the correlation between school districts' percentage share of needs with their percentage share of funding. The repeal of the common levy would be a setback for stability, fairness, and a sense of shared community. If Governor Pete Ricketts signs the bill, together with property tax relief, he will set up the exact sort of crisis that led to the learning community to begin with. More than 10 years ago, I transferred from Creighton Prep to Omaha Central, and it was one of the best decisions of my life. As the full impact on OPS plays out, if people are unhappy, they should remember this moment and remind Ricketts at the polls. Eli Hoke of Omaha writes, Omahans lose with HDR's decision not to build its global headquarters downtown. A building is more than a building when it's located in the city's central core. It is a catalyst. When major players in the Omaha business community, such as Woodman of the World, ConAgra, First National, and Gavilon, decide to invest in the downtown area, Omahans were rewarded with increased urban infill in the form of arts, entertainment, retail, and residential. The old market and its surrounding area is the face of Omaha. It makes the first impression as visitors enter the city via Eppley Airfield. Downtown should be able to proudly showcase major businesses that call Omaha home, but sadly it cannot due to lack of parking. Maybe it's time for city leaders to take a hard look at improving Omaha's mass transit. In the middle to late 90s, Omaha had a mayor who was an advocate for implementing light rail transit in the downtown area. Many scoffed at the idea and called him a dreamer. Perhaps he was a visionary. Hal Daub must be now saying, I told you so, right about now. Also on the issue of parking, Gregory Weidman of Omaha writes, Mayor Gene Stothert and other city leaders talk about how they want to promote downtown and attract companies like HDR to relocate there. However, I hosted clients downtown at the Flatiron Cafe last week after 6 p.m. and was forced to plug my parking meter a total of 3 times, getting changed twice from the restaurant. My clients were from out of town, and having to leave the table twice to plug the meters did not create a friendly environment for them. In fact, it was such an irritation, I doubt that we will select a downtown restaurant to host clients again. HDR probably did its clients and employees a favor by rethinking their new home office relocation project. It seems as though Omaha city leaders are saying one thing, but the current environment sends quite a different message. From Ashland, Donald Duncan writes, some of the reasons expressed by state lawmakers who wanted to return Nebraska to a winner-take-all system for choosing presidential electors was to bring us in line with the rest of the country. Using this logic, we should do away with our unicameral legislature and return to a partisan two-house body. Nebraska should be pushing the remaining 48 states, Maine awards its electoral votes the same way, to make the presidential elections more democratic. From Newman Grove, P.A. Miller writes, I wish the governor would have made a public appeal for the ideas for the new Nebraska license plates. My design would have been images of sandhill cranes and color at both ends of the numbers. People from all over the country come to Nebraska during the migration of the hundreds of thousands of these birds. I think what was chosen was pretty lame. From Omaha, J.F. Johnson writes, residents of Nickerson have expressed disapproval about a proposed chicken processing plant in their area. This is understandable. Why not build it in a metropolitan area? That's where the people are, the many consumers, and of course the many potential workers. If the investors and advocates want a plant so bad, why not build it in their own backyard? The plant would change the dynamics of this small town drastically. Ask the residents of Schuyler and Lexington how they enjoy similar plants in their cities. Ricky Fulton of Omaha writes, North Carolina recently enacted the Public Facilities Privacy and Security Act, which, among other things, would not allow people to sue in state court to enforce the city of Charlotte's non-discrimination ordinance. Naturally, this new law has caught outrage. Bruce Springsteen and other artists have canceled concerts in North Carolina in protest. But what is one community's dilemma can be another's opportunity. The National Basketball Association's 2017 All-Star Game is scheduled to be played in Charlotte. There is clamor to move the game out of state. I think Omaha CenturyLink Center would be a perfect spot. I urge the Metropolitan Entertainment and Convention Authority to get the All-Star Game moved to Omaha. It would be a financial boon. And finally, from Lincoln, Conrad Good Sr. writes, many thanks to World Herald columnist Michael Kelly for resurrecting the long-forgotten fact that Wyoming's Kenny Sailors, the player who revolutionized basketball, with his jump shot, was born in a far western town in Nebraska of Bushnell. In 1943, Sailors in his jump shot led the University of Wyoming to the NCAA men's basketball championship. And there you have it, our letters from the Public Pulse today from the Sunday World Herald.
Well, Drew Culla, medical doctor, writes in the New York Times about letting patients tell their stories. Friday night in the emergency department is about what you think. It starts off slow. A middle-aged man with a middling pneumonia, an older nursing home resident with a urinary tract infection that is making her delirious. Then come 2 heart attacks at the same time, followed by a drunken driver with a head bleed and half his ribcage fractured. At midnight, enrolled and inebriated members of a bachelorette party that has not gone, one assumes, according to plan. Amid the chaos, I break off to greet a thin, older man quietly bundled up on a hallway stretcher. I look over his chart and prior scans. His prostate cancer has grown through several chemotherapy regimens. His spine is full of tumor, and he's been vomiting everything he eats or drinks for weeks. He can't move the left side of his body after a recent stroke. He smiles, a charming, crooked smile. It hasn't been the best month of my life. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I asked him about his symptoms, when they started, how bad they got. He asked me where I went to medical school and do I have a girlfriend. I asked him if he's dizzy and whether there's blood in his stool. He tells me he immigrated from Greece 50 years ago, almost to the day. He won a scholarship to MIT and studied electrical engineering. There he met his wife, a fantastic cook, and started his first company. Now, decades later, he's alone in a crowded emergency room on a Friday night. His wife dead, his 2 sons overseas, a nurse visiting him once a week at home to help him with some medicines and make sure the various tubes coming out of his body aren't infected. I asked him when he last moved his bowels. Son, I'm dying. I'm alone. One day you'll learn there's more to a good death than how often I move my bowels. I paused. I am better at many things than I was when I started my journey to become a physician more than a decade ago, but I am not sure that understanding patients as people and placing them in the context of their long, messy, beautiful lives is one of them. Doctors are trained first to diagnose, treat, and fix, and second, to comfort and soothe. The result is a slow loss of vision and inability to see who and what people are outside the patient we see in the hospital. As we acquire new and more technical skills, we begin to devalue what we started. Understanding, empathy, imagination. We see patients dressed in hospital gowns and non-skid socks, not jeans and baseball caps, and train our eyes to see rashes and blood vessels while untraining them to see insecurities, joys, and frustrations. As big data consensus statements and treatment allegations pervade medicine, small gestures of kindness, spontaneity, the caregiving equivalents of holding open doors and pulling out chairs fall by the wayside. But all care is ultimately delivered at the level of an individual. And while we might learn more about a particular patient's preferences or tolerance for risk while explaining the pros and cons of a specific procedure or test, a more robust, more holistic understanding requires a deeper appreciation of who is this person I'm speaking with. In Britain, a small but growing body of research has found that allowing patients to tell their life stories has benefits for both patients and caregivers. Research-focused residents of long-term care facilities suggest that providing a biographical account of one's past can help patients gain insight into their current needs and priorities and allow doctors to develop closer relationships with patients by more clearly seeing the person behind the patient. In the United States, Medicare recently began paying doctors to talk with their patients about end-of-life planning. These conversations allow patients to discuss and explore their preferences about a slew of complex medical interventions, including clinical trials, transfers to the intensive care unit, use of mechanical ventilation or feeding tubes, and the desire to die at home or in the hospital. These discussions, too, may benefit from a biographical approach in which patients are able to elaborate on what is and what has been most important in their lives. To better serve patients, we need to see not only who they are, but also who they were, and ultimately who they hope to become at the end of life. How much more effective would we be as diagnosticians and healers if we had a more longitudinal understanding of the patient in front of us? If we saw not just a shrunken, elderly Greek man on the emergency room stretcher in front of us, but also the proud teenager flying across the Atlantic to start a new life half a century ago, the emergency room is by its nature an arena designed for quick thinking and swift action. There are certainly other places, times, and circumstances more conducive to probing goals of care discussions and lengthy forays into the internal lives of patients. Still, there is always some moment of grace and meaning we can help patients find in the time they have left. A moment that recalls a time when they felt most alive, even if it's just a fleeting conversation about gyros and electrical circuits and a busy emergency room late on Friday night.
From the World Herald, after months of back and forth, HDR's proposed 16-story, $152 million downtown headquarters finally crashed under the weight of just 100 valet parking spots. There were other unresolved points of contention between Omaha Performing Arts and HDR by the time the architecture and engineering firm rejected the downtown site early this month. And HDR has said rising cost of the entire project also contributed to the decision to pull the plug. But several people close to the situation say a disagreement over 100 valet parking spots for arts patrons was a tipping point that came before HDR pushed the project off the 11th and Dodge Street site. OPA pressed for a 100-year lease on parking spots, which were to be built in a garage as part of HDR's new headquarters. HDR wanted a 70-year lease. Even as the HDR plan unraveled, Mayor Gene Stothert tried 2 last-minute sweeteners to save the project. The city would pay nearly $20 million for a new parking garage across the street from the proposed HDR headquarters site, or the city would pay to build HDR's own garage to the tune of $20 million to $25 million. But the sweeteners didn't work. HDR said it will still build its new headquarters in Omaha, just not on the 11th and Dodge Street site. Parking on that site has been a thorn in the side of the project since almost day one. The 11th and Dodge site HDR picked for its headquarters is now a parking lot. The parking was set to be replaced and more spots added by a parking garage and educational facility OPA had proposed to build on the site of 3 century-old buildings east of the Holland Center, which OPA operates. When OPA in February backed off a controversial plan to demolish the 3 buildings, it set off a scramble to replace the more than 500 spaces that would have been in the OPA parking facility. OPA didn't consult HDR about scrapping the demolition and related expansion plan, the arts group said. It also didn't consult the city, Stothert said. The arts group was set to lose more than 250 spots in selling its 11th and Dodge land to HDR. Because OPA wouldn't be able to build its own parking garage, the arts group told HDR it wanted 300 spots in the garage that HDR was set to build as part of the tower project, Stothert said. HDR in turn said it would need spots in a garage under construction at the Capitol District across the street, Stothert said, and that's the garage that the city offered to buy. According to sources who wouldn't be named, the Performing Arts Group wouldn't settle on details to seal the deal. A sticking point were the terms of the lease for 100 valet parking stalls that OPA wanted for Holland Center patrons in the HDR garage. The only question we had left on the deck was that, said OPA Chairman John Gostock, who was involved with negotiations. The only question was whether the valet parking was going to be 50 years, 75 years, or 100 years, referring to the length of the lease. Gottschalk said he thought the hangup could have been resolved. He said there must have been other issues unrelated to the lingering parking questions that killed the deal. HDR Chairman and Chief Executive George Little declined to comment for the story. In a statement earlier this month, Little said the downtown deal fell through because of escalating costs and because of delays resulting from the loss of previously planned parking. The parking facility OPA was to construct east of the Holland Center. Meanwhile, contributing to conflict between HDR and OPA, the sources say, was OPA's pressing on points that were viewed as quibbles, like HDR paying for fencing and lighting to surround temporary parking during construction. Eventually, HDR just gave up on the 11th and Dodge site. Stothert tried to save the project, she said, by offering to have the city buy the parking garage under construction at the Capitol District, that project at 10th and Capitol Avenue. That's the garage where HDR was to have about 300 spots, Stothert said. She said the $19 million garage would have been paid for with city redevelopment bonds or by revenue bonds, whereby fees from parkers would be turned back to pay off the bonds. She said the public would have been able to park in the city garage. Of course, we understand that parking is an issue downtown, Stothert said, and that's what we've been working on since this all started. City planning consultant Steve Jensen said the city also made a last-minute offer to buy a city-owned garage on the HDR site instead of the company building its own. He said the proposal was made so late he didn't even know if the company considered it. Stothert said she still would be willing to buy the Capitol District garage if it would help HDR move to another downtown site. Mike Moylan, whose Shamrock Development is leading the $205 million Capitol District project, which includes a new Marriott hotel, said HDR came to him looking for additional parking. He said his project is willing and ready to accommodate HDR's needs. HDR had wanted to begin construction downtown in June. The lease on the current headquarters near 84th and West Dodge Road expires at the start of 2019. OPA officials say they wanted HDR as a neighbor, but also had to protect a vision to expand the performing arts campus in the future. They also needed parking, they said. Gostock, chairman of the Performing Arts Group and former publisher of the World Herald, said in a statement that he and HDR's Little verbally agreed to the new sale terms on March 11th. He said they turned over the details to their respective administrative and legal teams and then each left town for several days. At the time, Gostock said he thought the lease length of the 100 valet parking spots was the only issue to be resolved between the two organizations. I didn't feel we had a big lingering issue when I left, he said. OPA board member David Schlossberg also was involved in negotiations. At some point while Gostock was away, OPA stalled the negotiations. Upon his return on April 5th, he said he learned there were no signed documents for the sale of that lot at 11th and Dodge, and HDR pulled out 2 days later. On Friday, Goshawk said he would have accepted a shorter lease length than 100 years on the valet spots. The parking issue was contentious, Stoddard said, because Omaha Performing Arts wanted stalls in HDR's garage basically for free for 100 years, she said. And a parking stall costs money, $17,000 to $20,000 per stall to construct a parking garage, according to the city's parking manager, Ken Smith. And then each stall costs between $450 and $500 to maintain annually, he said. Stoddard said she met with Little in her office the day before HDR pulled out of the site and told Little that her company and said that Little told her that the company had not reached an agreement with Omaha Performing Arts. It sounded like the frustration of still not having the property secured was a problem, she said. Stoddard didn't take part in all the negotiations, but her administration worked on a broader downtown parking issues for both HDR and OPA. Architectural and engineering giant HDR is now back to the drawing board, leaving downtown supporters upset by an abrupt about-face on the decision announced almost a year ago to build on that downtown service lot. According to city records, Omaha Performing Arts owns about 180 stalls in the lot that's bounded by Dodge and Capitol and 11th and 12th Streets. The city of Omaha also owns some of that parcel as well, with 263 stalls. The Performing Arts Group leases some spaces on the lot to employees and tenants of the World Herald, whose headquarters is a few blocks away. The World Herald did everything asked by HDR and Omaha Performing Arts and the city, the newspaper said in a statement. The 100-year-old HDR, founded in Omaha, pledges to stay in its hometown, but is now searching for a different place to grow its more than 900-member local workforce, perhaps a site with no parking issues. Too bad that couldn't be resolved.
Lori Holland writes in the New York Times about turning motherhood into a script, and this is about Deanna Blizzard, who wrote and stars in One Funny Mother, which is playing in New York City. The day before beginning previews of her new off-Broadway show, One Funny Mother, Deanna Blizzard was taking cold medicine and tending to her 11-year-old daughter, who had recently received 9 stitches in her knee after falling in a creek. I should have expected this was how this show would launch, she said over lunch in Midtown. Motherhood can be messy, unpredictable, and full of awkward moments. Miss Blizzard has a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, too. Her subject matter, however, wasn't always welcomed at clubs early in her career. It was always a fight to talk about what compelled me, she said. Focusing on these sometimes delicate topics is largely the point of One Funny Mother. For example, it's sponsored by Fiera Arouser for her sexual enhancement device for women. It seems like the perfect uncomfortable match for us, Miss Blizzard said. So she put those stories into a script, which she finished in 2008, but put aside after taking a job warming up audiences at a daytime talk show. Several years later, she had an opportunity to take her show on the road. She's performed One Funny Mother across the country from near her home in Burlington County, New Jersey to Walla Walla, Washington, and it will open at New World Stages on Thursday. After her first performance here, Miss Blizzard, age 43, was still nursing her cold as she talked about her career in motherhood, being crowned Miss New Jersey in 1995, and the benefits of putting your crazy out there. These are edited excerpts from that conversation. Did you change the show at all for New York? Her answer, no. What I realized when we traveled around the country was that the language may be slightly different, but the insanity was the same. I started getting emails from women just saying, you make me feel so normal. I really did think I was going crazy. Doesn't matter your religion or social economic background, it's all the same. Everybody's kids are annoying, and everybody's husbands make them crazy. Before we get too deep into the interview, I have to know, why beauty pageants? Well, her answer is kind of crazy. I was graduating from Rowan University. I was thinking about going to medical school. I knew I could play the piano, and I could talk, so it's like, okay, let's do this. You were thinking about medical school, but instead entered a pageant? Her answer, I needed money to help pay for graduate school. She has a master's degree, but I was pretty awful. But you won Miss New Jersey? I did. The second year. The first year, nobody noticed me because I didn't know what I was doing, but it was while going to events for Miss New Jersey that I began to realize I was funny, just not always on purpose. How did you start doing comedy? Her answer, the good story is that I was turning 30, and my husband brought me a comedy class. The sad story is that I always had thought about doing stand-up, but when I considered doing it when I was 23, it was very daunting to me to have to stand in front of people and be embarrassed if I wasn't funny. What was the turning point? Her answer: I had taken my son to the mall, and he started having this fit, the kind of fit that a 2-year-old has that isn't going to stop. I had no idea what to do, so I hid in the china department. And I remember crouching down behind these dishes and thinking, this is the most embarrassed I've ever been in my whole life, and the comedy can't be this hard. Motherhood is way harder than comedy. What is it like out there for women in comedy? Her answer: for me, it was less about being a woman. It was about being a mom. When I was doing stand-up here in the city, there were a lot of clubs that kept saying, you know, you were funny, but can you talk about something different than your kids and family? Talk about riding the subway or dating. And I was like, but I don't ride subways and I don't date. This is what I do 24/7. Do you think some audiences just aren't interested in hearing about the messiness of motherhood? Her answer: I do feel like there is such a fine line. There's one joke in the show, and it's a joke, but there's such a truth behind it that if you complain about motherhood, people think you're ungrateful and you should just not talk about your kids because they're beautiful blessings. And yeah, you know, that's true. But if you spend enough time with the beautiful blessings, they get on your nerves and you want to punch them. A big message of our show is that if you put your crazy out there, you realize that everybody's crazy. Do those beautiful blessings think you're funny? Her answer: I think they think I'm funny at times, and they love it when I think they're funny. How do you have energy for doing this while raising 3 kids? Her answer: there's just an endless source of material, which is why I keep them around. But seriously, I'm exhausted, and I only have a dog. How are you doing this? Her answer: same thing that makes me tired gives me energy. I feel like there are so many women that give up things that they love, that thing that gives them energy. And raising 2 young girls, I want to say to them, always have that thing that energizes you and that feeds your soul.
From the Lincoln Journal-Star, the number of filibusters this session in the legislature that needed a vote to stop them was record-breaking, 24, the highest number ever. It's been very difficult, Speaker Galen Hadley said last week. It was astounding, really, by any measure when compared to previous years. The next highest number was 14, which was a record breaker as well. The momentous trend skyward started in 2012, coincidentally when Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers returned to the legislature, but you can only blame it on him indirectly. I want to make it absolutely clear I don't blame Senator Chambers for the increase in filibusters, Hadley said, but as he's always said, he's a good teacher. Newer senators are really learning from the master. The idea of a filibuster is to protect the minority party from the majority party running roughshod over them. But in recent years, Hadley said senators have gone from trying to protect the minority to just trying to stop a particular bill. I think we're becoming more of what I would call a 33-vote legislature, Hadley said. If a bill has any significant opposition, that opposition is going to require the body to get 33 votes to pass the bill. That's concerning, he said, if it becomes more and more common. We're just going to have tougher times getting things done, he said. Before 1992, no permanent rule existed that allowed for cloture motions, which are made to stop a filibuster and vote on a bill. But in 1991, after 2 sessions of long debates on abortion bills, the Rules Committee put forth a change to limit debate. It allows for 8 hours at all 3 stages of debate and 12 hours on appropriation bills before a priority cloture motion could be brought. Then Senator Don Wesley of Lincoln opposed the rule, saying he was proud the Nebraska legislature had never had to take the step of shutting off the voice of the people. When you limit debate, he said, you limit ideas, and stretching those ideas into something workable could take hours, even in the days of this discussion. Then Senator Scott Moore said, if 8 hours of debate wasn't enough to form a legitimate idea, senators needed to hone their skills. I happen to think it's very wrong when a very, very small minority of 2 to 3 people can hold up this body and keep things from happening, he said in debate on the rule change. Lincoln Senator Chris Beitler also favored the rule change. Without it, he said, the legislature would be at the whim of the minority. Previous to the rule change, senators were allowed to file a motion to suspend the rules and move to advance a bill without further debate. But it could only be addressed after all amendments that were filed were debated. and it was really no rule at all, Beitler said, in the hands of someone set on killing a bill. Chambers opposed the rule change, saying extended debate could be used to make a bill better, and Senator Brad Ashford said he was also vehemently opposed. The rule change passed, though, on a 29-12 vote without a filibuster, although not because it wasn't suggested, and the 8-hour requirement was removed from the rules in 2002. For 3 years after the cloture rule was instituted, the use remained low. And until last year, filibusters averaged about 4 a year, with low of 1 and a high of 12. This year, though, 18 bills and 1 resolution were filibustered, 5 of them twice. 9 of those bills ultimately passed. 10 failed when 33 votes could not be mustered. The Speaker announced before the session that first-round debate would be limited to 6 hours rather than 8. He saved the legislature 16 hours of debate time with the decision, but he said he would be loath to reduce the number of hours on a second or final debate. His goal to allow all priority bills to see debate and resolution was not successful. Despite the hours of filibuster time taken, the legislature was able to get some important things done, passing legislation that will have a long-term effect on the state, said longtime lobbyist Walt Radcliffe. Those included Omaha Area Learning Community Funding, the Roads Infrastructure Bank, the Wind Energy Bill, and less heralded but nonetheless important Niobrara River Management Plan. And those included Omaha Area Learning Community Funding and infrastructure banks that were also important. That's quite a bit of stuff, he said. And yeah, some things didn't get done, like Medicaid expansion, winner-take-all presidential elections. Many state legislatures have some type of rules to limit debate or limit the time each senator can speak on a bill. Most of the 10 states surrounding Nebraska don't use the filibuster much to block debates or to stop debates or block passage of a bill. Nebraska seems to be unique among the middle-of-the-country states. Hadley's advice to the next speaker: explore whether the time for each round of a filibuster is right, or even if he or she wants to have set hours, and whether 33 votes is the right number to stop a debate. It only takes 30 to stop a governor's veto. Radcliffe said he remembers a telephone deregulation bill in 1986 that passed on a 25-24 vote. You couldn't pass anything 25-24. You couldn't pass something 29-20 today, he said. I don't think filibusters are a terrible thing. I just think it needs to be contained a bit. About 8 years was spent on the dental hygiene bill that didn't get a vote, Radcliffe said. That's just too bad that much work went into something that they didn't even get to, he said.
Jeffrey Zaks and Rebecca Treeman, who are professors at Washington University in St. Louis, write about from the New York Times, sorry, you can't speed read. Our favorite Woody Allen joke is the one about taking a speed reading course. I read War and Peace in 20 minutes, he says. It's about Russia. The promise of speed reading to absorb text several times faster than normal without any significant loss of comprehension can indeed seem too good to be true. Nevertheless, it has long been an aspiration for many readers as well as the entrepreneurs seeking to serve them. And as the production rate for new reading matter has increased and people read on a growing array of devices, the lure of speed reading has only grown stronger. The first popular speed reading course, introduced in 1959 by Evelyn Wood, was predicted on the idea that reading was slow because it was inefficient. The course focused on teaching people to make fewer back and forth eye movements across the page, taking in more information with each glance. Today, apps like SpeedRead with Spritz aim to minimize eye movement even further by having a digital device present you with a stream of single words, one after the other, at a rapid rate. Unfortunately, the scientific consensus suggests that such an enterprise should be viewed with suspicion. In a recent article in Psychological Science in a Public Interest, one of us, Professor Treeman, and colleagues revealed the empirical literature on reading and concluded as extremely unlikely you can greatly improve your reading speed without missing out on a lot of meaning. Certainly, readers are capable of rapidly scanning a text to find a scientific word or a piece of information or pick up a general idea of what the text is about, but this is skimming, not reading. We can definitely skim, and it may be that speed reading systems help people skim better. Some speed reading systems, for example, instruct people to focus only on the beginnings of a paragraph and chapters. This is probably a good skimming strategy, Participants in a 2009 experiment read essays that had half the words covered up, either the beginning of the essay, the end of the essay, or the beginning or the end of each individual paragraph. Reading half paragraphs led to better performance on a test of memory for the passage's meaning than did reading only the first or second half of the text, and it worked as well as skimming under time pressure. But speed reading, techniques that aim to guide eye movements so that we can take in more information from each glance, seem doomed to fail. There's only a small area in retina for which our visual acuity is very high. Our eyes are seriously limited in their precision outside of that. This means that we can take in only a word or so at each glance, as well as a little bit about the words on either side. In fact, since the 1960s, experiments have repeatedly confirmed that when people speed read, they simply do not comprehend the parts of the text that their eyes skip over. A deeper problem, however, and the one that also threatens the new speed reading apps, is that big bottleneck in reading isn't perception, but language processing words into meanings. Have you ever tried listening to an audio recording with the speaking rate dialed way up? Doubling that speed, in our experience, leaves individual words perfectly identifiable, but makes it just about impossible to follow the meaning. The same phenomenon occurs with written text. As in all forms of human behavior, there is a trade-off in reading between speed and accuracy. You can learn to skim so that you can spend more time looking where the more important words are likely to be, and if the words are present in a stream, you may be able to learn which words to focus on, which to ignore. However, that does not mean that you can somehow magically read parts of a page that you don't look at or process all the words in a super fast sequence. Reading is about language comprehension, not visual ability. If you want to improve your reading speed, your best bet, as old-fashioned as it sounds, is to read a wide variety of written material and to expand your vocabulary. Just don't expect to read War and Peace in 20 minutes.
Good point. Well, from the World Herald on April the 14th, 1930, a stream of 15,000 visitors journeyed to Lincoln to see the Sower statue. Though the 19-foot bronze sculpture was lying flat on its side in a rail car, it drew a record crowd, the World Herald reported at the time. Days earlier, the newspaper had run a photo of the statue when it passed through Omaha by train. Weeks later, on May 3rd, the newspaper would report that the bronze had been finally and firmly affixed to the Capitol Tower. Nowhere did the paper mention the man who sculpted it. That man, a New York sculptor named Lee Laurie, has become a mere footnote in his own artwork story. Few Nebraskans mentioned his name last month, even as they joked about the Sower's appearance on the state's new license plate, even when they found out that the Sower wasn't their Sower at all. Many Nebraskans were surprised to learn that Laurie had created another in Michigan. In fact, those are just two of the many Sowers in a body of work that spanned 7 decades and 23 states. In his day, Laurie was a prolific and well-regarded sculptor. His artwork appears in such prominent places as Rockefeller Center in New York City, on the facade of a public library branch in Los Angeles, and on the walls of the Louisiana State Capitol, among other places. So why don't we know? Well, because by all accounts, that's the way he wanted it. At a celebratory dinner in 1922, the architect Bertram Goodhue said a few words about Laurie, whom he'd worked closely with for almost 3 decades. "Please drag Mr. Laurie forward," Goodhue said after introducing him as, quote, "one of the quietest, to my mind, the ablest, and assuredly the shyest sculptor in the world." Born in Germany in 1877, Laurie immigrated to the United States with his mother, a young widow, when he was only 4 years old. They settled in Chicago, where his mother struggled to support her son as a seamstress and housekeeper. When times were tough, she'd send the young Laurie to live in orphanages. In these places, he would write. The children would beat up a newcomer if he mentioned that his parents were still alive. Greg Harm, a Nebraska native who's written 2 books about Laurie, thinks this may be what left him with a lifelong shyness, an intense sense of humility. He pretty much didn't want to blow his own horn. He sort of flew under the radar of art history, Harm said. Laurie would eventually develop an interest in drawing, earning money sketching beer ads and passers-by on the street. In 1891, at age 14, he answered an ad from a Chicago newspaper and found himself in the studio of Henry Richard Park, a prominent sculptor. There, he would help create statues for the legendary 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He studied under other sculptors, and his skills grew. In 1895, he walked into the office of Bertram Goodhue's design firm and asked for a job, and he got it. Goodhue and Laurie would work together for the next 29 years, collaborating on more than 100 buildings, including the Los Angeles Public Library, several buildings at West Point in New York, and the National Academy of Sciences building in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, Laurie would graduate from Yale University, go on to teach there, and at Harvard as well. Through it all, Laurie avoided calling attention to himself. He rarely signed his work and only once likened his role to that of a fiddler in the orchestra. He was a very modest man, said his great-grandson, Chris Laurie of Connecticut. He was definitely willing not to take credit or give up credit for his work. He just really enjoyed doing it. As his career progressed, the sculptor's style evolved with the times. Eventually, Laurie adopted the ornamental style known as Art Deco, popular in the decade between the world wars. Later in his life, Chris Laurie said the aesthetic would lead some to suspect the sculptor of being a communist. It was this style, bold geometric shapes and rich colors, that would characterize one project that for many defined Laurie's career, the Nebraska State Capitol. Commissioned in 1919 and designed by Goodhue and University of Nebraska professor Hartley Burr Alexander, the Capitol would be a 13-year project for Laurie. His presence in the building includes stone carvings of bison and pioneers. Colored engravings of 2 Native Americans greet visitors to the Warner Legislative Chamber on the doors. The Capitol was probably the major commission in his career because there was so much work and it stretched over 10 years, said Dale Gibbs, a professor emeritus of architecture at the University of Nebraska Lincoln. He also wrote a chapter in the Laurie book, A Harmony of the Arts. But Laurie's work in the Capitol is not without criticism. Some have claimed that his female figures, such as those representing wisdom and mercy on the north entrance, are hard to distinguish from their male counterparts. Overlooking it all, 400 feet above the ground, Laurie placed a statue of a man. The sewer's physique was based on that of Hollywood model reported in 1940 to be named Nelson Bennett. And his scale, 19.5 feet tall and weighing almost 10 tons, evokes the classical heroes of Greece and Rome. He stands as Laurie's tallest human figure, Harm said. His closest competitor is Atlas in Rockefeller Center. In total, the New York sculpture is 45 feet tall, but Atlas is only 15 feet tall. Laurie meant for the sower to serve as an icon for Nebraska's people, the salt-of-the-earth farmers and their families scratching out a living on the Great Plains, so it would be easy to assume that the sower figure belongs to Nebraska. But Harm knows of at least 6 others that appear in works Laurie has had a hand in. There's one on the Beaumont Tower at Michigan State University, which accidentally served as the model for the first incarnation of Nebraska's new license plates. There's one on the Perlman Building in Philadelphia. There's a female sower in Rockefeller Center, another on the face of a medal designed for the Society of Medalists, and on the floor of a New York mausoleum for philanthropist Edward Harkness, a sower appears as one of 24 figures representing the hours of the day. In an artist statement to the Society of Medalists, Laurie once explained why he was so captivated by the sower. Growing up in Illinois, he wrote, he used to watch a farmer spread grain over his field. All of us really are sowers, he wrote, and we should not expect life to yield much in return for little, and little for nothing, or anything at all, for the mere wishing. Laurie, Gibbs said, could identify with the ideal. The simple farmer, the sower, does not seek praise or fame. He simply works for his trade day after day, season after season. Harm once interviewed a man who worked with Laurie during the sculptor's later years. Harm asked him once if Laurie ever spoke of a favorite project. He said no. Harm said he didn't talk about his work, and to him, each one of his jobs in sculpture was really just a job. Every time he finished one, he was on to the next just to earn a living. Less than a year before the workers installed the sower on top of the Capitol, America entered the Great Depression. Suddenly, the country had little appetite for large-scale building projects with rich statuary. Laurie left New York and moved to Easton, Maryland. Despite the country's economic troubles, he found steady work, though none of his projects would ever equal the scale of the Nebraska Capitol. Still unwilling to promote himself, he lived modestly in his old age, not poor, but close, said his great-grandson Chris. But he was always busy, still creating pieces for West Point when he died in 1963 at age 85. Many in his own family didn't realize the full scope of this work until later, said granddaughter-in-law Caroline Laurie. She met Grandpa Laurie only a couple of times, she said, and each time he was soft-spoken and unassuming. You would never have known he was a famous sculptor, Caroline said. For many Nebraskans, Laurie is nothing but a name, quickly forgotten in heated conversations about the state's most famous statue. Recent debate over the new license plate design that has spurred barbs and innuendos about Laurie's work. For Harm, in many ways a keeper of the legacy, it's an insult to the man. It's a fine work of art. To say that it's profane or obscene, anything like that, is just plain stupid, at least in my view, he said. There are only a handful of scholars of art or architecture who know much about Laurie these days, Harm said. Although guide Ted Holbrook said visitors touring the Capitol will hear his name and a synopsis of his work, many who work in buildings Laurie helped to craft have just never heard of him. So maybe the sower then is an appropriate symbol of its creator. From a distance, it's hard to see, but up close, it casts a long shadow.
Joanne Kaufman writes in the New York Times about an excellent stand-in for her house, and this is concerning Carrie Butler, an actress. One morning, more than 30 years ago, Sister Mary Arlene, the principal of St. Francis Cabrini, a now defunct parochial grammar school in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, commandeered the public address system on behalf of a very special student. Everyone, please pray for Carrie Butler, she urged, because today she has her final callback to play Annie on Broadway. Not everyone saw the event as sufficiently just cause to petition the Almighty. I thought, that's stupid. I'm not praying for that, recalled Joy Marzino, who also attended Cabrini. Alas, Miss Butler didn't get the part, undoubtedly because certain people didn't pray. Nevertheless, she grew up to have principal roles in Broadway musicals like Little Shop of Horrors, Hairspray, Catch Me If You Can. In the musical spoof Disaster that opened last month, she plays a tenacious reporter hot on a story, and she plays the therapist in the upcoming Gilmore Girls reunion series on Netflix. Apparently, a big-hearted sort, Miss Butler forgave Mr. Mazzarini, his youthful posse. The two have been married for 2 decades. Perhaps playing Kim opposite his Hugo in a high school production of Bye Bye Birdie helped turn things around. Couple now live in a playfully decorated penthouse duplex in a condominium on the Upper West Side with their 2 daughters, 10 and 4. We're in a high-rise building, but there are no other high-rises around us, so we have this open view of the sky, Miss Butler said, and we have a sliver of river. The apartment was a compromise of sorts. Miss Butler, age 44, who grew up in a attached row house in Brooklyn, had always wanted to live in the suburbs, and for a brief while, it looked as if she would get her wish. In 1997, she and her husband were partway through the process of buying a house and watching New Jersey when I woke up in a cold sweat and I said, I can't do this. I can't leave the city, recalled Mr. Mazzarini, age 47, the former head writer on Sesame Street, who's working on a musical. So Carrie was like, well, then I'm picking the apartment. Yeah, in a case of delayed, if only partial gratification, the couple bought a weekend home on the Jersey Shore a few years ago. I knew I didn't want to live in a theater district. I never lived there, but it's just not neighborhoody, Miss Butler said. I need parks. Joey didn't want to go up further than 86th Street, and our broker was like, you really should see the West 90s. They did, and they're glad. The duplex is successor to the one Miss Butler bought soon after landing her first Broadway show, Blood Brothers, 1993, has the outdoor space that is a must. The terrace, which is large enough to hold a pair of chaise lounges and a small table and chairs, is an acceptable stand-in for the yard she lost out on in New Jersey. With Miss Butler's blessing, Mr. Mazzarini took the lead in selecting the furniture. Typically, he would know the possibilities, generally contemporary and mid-century modern, and present his wife with 2 or 3 options. And so it was thumbs up to the white Jensen Lewis dining table, the Crayola-colored dining chairs and bar stools with cutout backs, the light fixture that resemble planets in orbit, the heather gray sofa and chair, and the coffee table with a storage compartment. And it was be still my heart, to the massage chair, a present from Mr. Mazzarelli on the opening night of Little Shop of Horrors. Perhaps he figured that because he had bought Miss Butler a useful and much appreciated gift, surely she would not begrudge him a similarly useful, if extravagant, addition to the apartment. Just a little something he fell hard for on a trip to Asia, a Japanese toilet. It's the Porsche of toilets, Miss Butler said disgustingly, taking a visitor upstairs for a viewing of the Toto, and as a part of the same tour to show off the Jonathan Adler shower curtain, which she loves. I don't know if you tried them, but they have things that shoot things at you from different directions. They have dryers, they have warmers. She added, Joey never told me how much the toilet cost. I didn't find out how much until it got here. We have them in both bathrooms, which I was actually annoyed about. I was like, why do we need two expensive toilets? A couple renovated the kitchen and added closets when they moved in 15 years ago. And although it wasn't part of the game plan, a year ago they redid the floors and the bathrooms. Joey came home one day to several inches of water on the top floor, Miss Butler said. Our house on the Jersey Shore escaped Hurricane Sandy, and then we had a flood here. The walls are covered with her daughter's artwork, as well as some drawings by Mr. Mazzarelli's father. There's also a Hirschfeld Miss Butler as Penny Pingleton in Hairspray. It may not be a house in the suburbs, but it's homey, and that's what matters most to Miss Butler. A basket in the living room holds pillows for tossing on the floor when the family watches television together. A green-thumbed neighbor has befriended her daughters and is teaching them how to cultivate herbs and cook with them. And very soon it will be the season to do their own planting on their own balcony. The family is hoping for a more impressive harvest this year. Typically, we get maybe one carrot and a few tomatoes, Miss Butler said. So we'll make salad and eat it outside.
Funny. Those are some fancy toilets. I've seen those.
Yeah, there's quite an article on them.
Well, from the World Herald today, following the 11 a.m. Mass at St. Francis Cabrini, the downtown area parish will host a time-honored event, the Spaghetti Dinner. It's a massive feast that has taken weeks to prepare, ungodly quantities of ingredients, and lots of volunteers. It will feed several thousand Omahans who will line up for takeout or dine in, with table service and volunteer wait staff who will say what is arguably the best word in the Italian language, mangia, or eat. But the Spaghetti Dinner, now in its 60th year or so, is more than delicious Italian meal. It's about being Italian. It isn't about being Italian, said volunteer and 1960 graduate Nick Trenisi. It's about sharing your culture with other people so you can support the school. First and foremost, it's a fundraiser aimed at helping the parish, named for the patron saint of immigrants, serve its latest generation of newcomer families. At $9 a plate, it will net the parish something like $20,000, which then goes to support the next door school at South 10th Street. It's one small but important way to keep the doors open at All Saints, where very few families can afford the $1,600 a year tuition, and no one can pay the $8,000 per child actual cost. Second, it's a revered tradition. This twice-a-year event is practically holy. It's a Bible. Its Bible is a stuffed binder of names and phone numbers, recipes, to-do lists, and maps where the tables go. And its rituals are carefully spelled out. The meatballs are made from scratch a week in advance. The pork and beef bones get roasted 4 days ahead. And at 5 a.m. on Friday, the kitchen door opens so the high priest of the Spaghetti Dinner, about a half dozen volunteers, including Dave Morrow, lovingly dubbed the token Italian, can get the sauce going. Third, it's a community builder, a time when descendants of those original Italian immigrants who filled the Little Italy neighborhood south of downtown come home. They'll see old faces with old names like Vendette and Ferraro, and meet new faces like the African names of Arop. The parish also wants to fold in the millennials and empty nesters moving into the area's trendy new apartments. The parish school opened in 1955 and underwent several name changes. First, it was St. Philomena's, just like the church next door. But in 1961, the Vatican questioned the saintliness of the 3rd century woman, and so both church and school got a new name that year, St. Francis Cabrini. She was an immigrant whose mission was to serve Italian immigrants in the United States. The Italian-American nun opened hospitals, schools, and orphanages coast to coast and repeatedly passed through Omaha. But even Cabrini's vulnerable name was erased from the school building amid waves of Catholic school closings and consolidations. St. Francis Cabrini Catholic School became Catholic Southeast Educational Center in 1972, and then in 1989, All Saints. Around 2000, as new Sudanese refugees were arriving in Omaha, a local nun who started an agency to help them all steered new arrivals to All Saints. By 2012, the Archdiocese of Omaha decided the math just wasn't working and slated the school to close. People like Mike Farrow, a nearly lifelong resident of the neighborhood and 1988 grade school graduate, protested. They wanted to close our school, said Mike, whose father graduated from the same school and who has a daughter there now. And they said, no, you're not going to close our school. The Archdiocese changed its mind and put All Saints under the same nonprofit that helps underwrite Holy Name and Sacred Heart. This was a massive boost. But the help from Christian urban education covers only about half the school's $1.2 million budget. St. Francis Cabrini Church pitches in what it can, but certainly isn't flush with cash. I don't have a secretary. I don't have a janitor, said Reverend Damian Zerline after picking up the church phone on the first ring. The main ministry is just supporting the school. That ministry is important, he said. Most of the school's 163 students qualify for federal free or reduced price lunch, a measure of poverty. About 40% of them have Sudanese-born parents. Their parents, often working long hours and multiple jobs, can't always get to school events or even help with fundraisers like the spaghetti dinner. Yet nearly all of the students graduate from high school, and some are now in college. A third of the kids ride what might be the only Catholic school bus in the city. They cram in 3 to a seat on a route that stretches from 30th and Q in South Omaha to 17th and Laird in North Omaha. They lug full backpacks, and each child, on the day I rode along, carried home a book. I had to smile at one choice of a song. The Diocese Song was the name of the book. The coming-of-age novel was one of my favorites, too, at age 14, the writer says. Nadul is the 5th of 7 children. She's a younger brother and sister at All Saints, and an older sister who went to All Saints and is now at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she's majoring in social work. Nidal will go to Mercy High next year. She said she loves the teachers at All Saints because they're really nice and caring. They try their best to help you understand what you're learning, she said. Given the school's needs, the spaghetti dinner remains as vital as it ever was. The Ferraros, Mike, a steam fitter, and wife Christian, a waitress at Casio's, take their responsibility as event organizers very seriously. They've run the event's prep and cleanup schedule every Sunday at the church bulletin. Preparations begin April 2nd with baking and frosting cookies. Cleanup will go until 9 p.m. tonight or when finished. I caught up with them in the basement of All Saints School as they directed traffic. From day one in 1956, this kitchen was seeing spaghetti dinners, Mike said. Last week, volunteers used utensils almost as big as canoe oars to stir 100 pounds of chopped onions browning on a stovetop. Christian opened the walk-in fridge to show floor-to-ceiling containers filled with meatballs. 9,000, Christian said. Ballparking the event is 60 years old. That's about the number of on the t-shirts that they're selling, at least. Mike and Christian have figured the parish has served 1 million meatballs and 100 tons of spaghetti. It's hard to wrap your mind around those figures. Making the nearly 400 gallons of sauce for just one spaghetti dinner requires 144 7-pound cans of tomato paste, 54 cups of salt, 144 cups of sugar, and loads of granulated garlic, black pepper, and basil. Dave Morrow has to stand on a stool as he stirs the batch of sauce. Most important thing is don't burn the bottom, my Nana told me, said Morrow, who's been making the sauce for 33 years. He said other sauce makers have it down to a science. They have learned to drape walls in plastic sheeting and the vats in aluminum foil to make the cleanup easier. They have streamlined the sauce making so it only takes 12 hours instead of 22. In the old days, they even brought in cots and napped in the parish hall. As they've aged, they're eager to see new faces come to help because they know that what tastes best about the dinner is not the tangy tomato sauce, but the fellowship, the neighborhood ties in Little Italy, and the sense of purpose. Standing in the gym, Mike said the school and church have always been home for immigrants. That's the history of this church, he said, pointing to the yellow news clippings. So it's rather fitting that the Sudanese find this building a school that they can call home. Sounds like a great thing in a really tight-knit neighborhood. So, and Gary, I think that does it for another good Sunday of some great articles.
Yeah, it certainly does. Well, we hope everyone has a very good day, week, and we return you to Emily in the control room.
Alright. Like I said, this brings us to the end of your live reading. I want to thank both Brad and Gary. We love all our volunteers. You guys are so awesome and all our readers. Thank you so much for always
Boston Marathon is tomorrow.
getting towards that time now. So I'm going to
Already.
the rest of your program.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to Radio Talking Book Network and keep listening. There's no